Well, the Federal Treasurer played school principal kind of today as he called in a delegation from the general insurance industry to talk about how they're supporting bushfire victims. Now, insurers have received almost 9,000 claims since September, totalling $700 million. Now, you've got to take that into some context because this is before the majority of claims have come in from New South Wales and Victoria after the blazes which began from New Year's Eve. I caught up with Treasurer Josh Frydenberg earlier today. Treasurer, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be with you, Chris.
So did you give the insurance companies what they were expecting, a good kicking?
Well, we had a very constructive discussion because ultimately the insurance companies are a big part of this recovery process. They've already had 8,500 claims submitted, totalling around $700 million worth of losses. Around 20% of those claims have been assessed, given that the fires have been going for some months now, and around half of those claims that have been assessed have been settled. So they told me that they'll be working as quickly as possible to ensure that money gets to those people who need it most, because so many people have lost everything that they have.
You dragged them into that meeting today. Was there a reason for that? Were you, did you have evidence that maybe they weren't towing the line as you hoped for?
Well, we wanted to get an update from them about the progress that they are making, and they have taken a number of steps, Chris, like providing emergency accommodation to people who need it, cash support to people who just need to buy the very basics after they've lost their property, as well as bringing in additional staff, sometimes from overseas, to ensure a 24/7 service, as well as getting assessors and recovery specialists out into the field, and to ensure that they can quickly assess those properties and then make the contribution. So a lot is already being done. What I wanted to do was to underline the importance that they begin the rebuilding phase as quickly as possible, that they put a priority on using local tradespeople in those communities because jobs will be very important, and to work out how we as a federal government, working with the states, can provide support for them to do their job. So, for example, we discussed about providing access into the communities where it's safe to do so. We discussed the removal of debris after commercial and residential properties have been destroyed, adopting sort of a more holistic approach that we saw adopted in Victoria after Black Saturday, as well as the federal government collecting more data from the insurance companies about where they are making progress, because if there are some bottlenecks or some capacity constraints in particular towns or around particular postcodes, we want to know so that we can quickly rectify the situation.
Did the conversation of climate change come up in this meeting? Why I say that is because if you believe the science, we could be having worse bushfires into the future, and that spells increased premiums to me. Did they indicate that that might be the case into the future?
Well, I did a doorstop with Rob Whelan, the CEO of the Insurance Council, after the meeting, and he was asked those very questions, and he did say that climate change is real, that it is a factor that they take into account, and that we should expect more catastrophic events into the future, and mitigation, adaptation are important. And as you know, Chris, the Prime Minister has foreshadowed a formal inquiry into what has happened and learning the lessons of what has occurred, including maybe some changes that will need to be made around fuel reduction, planning, zoning, all those sort of issues will need to be considered as well, because the climate is becoming hotter and drier, and this is having an impact.
One of the things that we get to in terms of discussion in the rebuilding phase after a natural disaster is the fact that quite often the rebuilders, those that are tasked with rebuilding buildings, etc., they can be scamming those who become victims in the process. Are the insurers aware of that, and did you stress that upon them, that we need to steer clear of scammers?
It's a very good point, and it did come up in the discussion, and I was accompanied by the Secretary of the Department of Treasury, but also by senior representatives of ASIC and APRA, the two regulators. One's a conduct regulator, the other prudential regulator, and that very issue came up of unregistered builders as well as unlicensed agents that may seek to mediate between somebody who's had their property destroyed and the insurance company.
Yeah.
Now, if they're unlicensed to do so, ASIC will come down very hard on them, and that was discussed at length, and ASIC made it very clear that they will strongly respond to any individuals or organisations that are being unscrupulous in their behaviour and seeking to profit out of people's misery, and the Insurance Council and insurance companies will be providing that relevant information to ASIC.
Could I rewind the tape to yesterday and this major announcement from government after the cabinet meeting of $2 billion over 2 years? Does that mean that you've given up any hope of a surplus?
Well, the surplus has never been an end in itself, Chris. It's always been about Australia living within its means and having responsible economic management so that we have the fiscal and financial flexibility to respond to economic shocks whenever they occur. And as you know, we've announced about $1 billion of additional funding since the election for drought support. We announced about $500 million of funding as an interim response to the Royal Commission into Aged Care's interim report. And now we have these dramatic and terrible bushfires that have seen the loss of life and the loss of property, and we are responding as the public would expect us to do.
Okay, so but as the treasurer of the country, you're still in charge of the till and the budget. Do you want a surplus, or does it mean that the surplus has to be suspended for a time?
Our priority is not the financial cost, not the budget bottom line, but the bottom line of delivering the support to those communities who need it most. This money that we announced yesterday, importantly, is in addition, Chris, to existing disaster recovery payments and allowances under existing mechanisms. This $2 billion will go towards additional support to small business, will go towards local councils, will go to a mental health initiative, will support the restoration of the environment and the protection of the wildlife that have been so badly damaged, as well as the rebuild of community, economic and social infrastructure.
So does the political capital of coming up with a surplus has now gone from your mind?
We've always been consistent. The surplus in itself has never been an end that we have sought, or a trophy for the shelf of the cabinet. It's never been an end in itself. What it has been a sign that Australia is living within its means. But when you have a catastrophic fire like today, and that we see still burning across the country, then the government must, at a federal level and indeed at state levels and local government levels, respond to that need.
Okay, one last one. I've noticed on social media some of the Greenies have been posting how gleeful they are with the burning down of the Eden wood chip mill. There's several posts today saying, yes, in all of this horrific loss, some really good news. The Eden chip mill is burning down all buildings and infrastructure, as well as the wood chip pile, a major cause of ecosystem collapse. Your response to that sort of reaction?
That's madness. I mean, any property damage is bad. Indeed, any loss of life is tragic and worse.
Yeah.
And what everyone should be focused on, regardless of their politics or their ideology, is about serving the communities that are in need, and that's where our immediate focus has been. And Chris, you've seen an unprecedented response from the federal government. You've seen the call out of up to 3,000 ADF reservists. As we speak tonight, you've got Chinook helicopters and Black Hawk helicopters ferrying the firefighters and emergency service personnel to the most difficult terrain. You've got our amphibious vessels like the HMAS Choules and HMAS Adelaide helping to evacuate people and to get supplies and stores to those who need it. This response from the government is right across every portfolio, every area of responsibility, because we must deliver that support to people who need it most. The Prime Minister is leading from the front in that respect. It
certainly is a shock and awe response. You're exactly right. Thank you so much for your time, and all the very best for the rest of the year.
Thanks, Chris, and our thoughts go out with those communities that are still battling those terrible fires.